So I'm delighted to be moderating this panel with some wonderful participants. First we have to my direct right, Timothy Stewart Winter, who is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, Newark. He's the author of Queer Clout, Chicago and the Rise of Gay Politics from 2016, and that received the John Boswell Prize from the Committee on LGBT History. His essay, Queer Law and Order, appeared in a Journal of American History special issue on the carceral state. His writing has also appeared in, among other venues, the Journal of the History of Sexuality, Gender and History, the Journal of the History of Sexuality, Dissent, and the New York Times. Then immediately to his right is our wonderful Doris Morgan Rueda, who is, you probably already know from her organization of this conference. She's a legal historian who studies the intersection of juvenile justice, the Latinx experience, and the American borderlands. She received her doctorates at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in 2022, and currently is the Law and History Fellow at the Center for Law and History here. She has articles, book chapters, and essays that explore juvenile justice, Latinx history, legal history, and art. Her current project is a book on the history of 20th century borderland juvenile justice through the lens of incarcerated youth in the Arizona State Industrial Schools. And last but not least, we have Russell K. Robinson, who is the Walter Perry Johnson Professor of Law and the Faculty Director of the Center on Race, Sexuality, and Culture at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Robinson's scholarly and teaching interests include anti-discrimination law, race and sexuality, law and psychology, constitutional law, and media and entertainment law. So I know we're running closely with the time because of the wonderful conversation. So I want to start without further ado.
Thanks so much. And thank you to all of you for being here as well. My subject today is anti-gay policing in the post-World War II period. And I want to begin with a story about two men. In March 1949, Norman Powell Hayne, age 32, was arrested by a plainclothes vice patrolman while cruising in Lafayette Park, also known as Lafayette Square, across the street from the White House, and charged with committing an obscene act. Hayne did something a little surprising at that point, given that he worked for the federal government. He called his boss from the police station. He needed $25 collateral to be released. At the time, the vice squad often let men arrested while cruising, if it was a first offense, forfeit this amount and go home without a prosecutor or court reviewing the case. Hayne's boss got the money, paid the collateral, and drove him to the hotel where he was renting a room. Norman Powell Hayne learned that his boss was truly a mensch. Not only did he bail him out late on a Saturday night, despite having a wife and 2 children under 3, but he also finessed things so that Hayne could resign quietly, instead of having his boss's boss find out about his legal problem. Asked years later why he called his boss, who had also helped him get the job, Hayne had a simple explanation. He had no one else to turn to, having moved from New York to take the job at the start of January. By resigning and relocating, Hayne anticipated and indeed prevented possible state action in the form of being fired. After returning to New York, Hayne gingerly wrote to his now ex-boss purely on a friendly basis. He had found a private sector job that was lower paying, but there's no reason to believe it won't continue as long as I want it. He wrote elliptically of his gratitude. Finding out what a person and a friend you were was the nicest thing that could have happened. His now former boss replied, "We've missed you and the good work that you were doing, but we can afford to do so if you are contented and happy." After the Korean War began the following year in 1950, Hayne wrote, wondering if his ex-boss could find out whether Navy reservists like himself were likely to be called up. Both men would have known this scenario could force Hayne either to disclose or not disclose his arrest. The reply from his former boss, "Without using your name, I have checked with the Navy Department," and then gave reassuring details about the fact that he was unlikely to be called up, at least in the short term. In short, Hayne navigated the aftermath of his arrest partly by a kind of self-policing that drew upon discretion and informal networks in the face of his legal vulnerability, what I'm calling the vice squad in your head. While Hayne must have known he was lucky to be able to resign, he could not have imagined how much worse things would get for men like him during the Lavender Scare, particularly in Washington. Over the following years, purges across the federal government began during a 1950 Senate investigation. In 1953, the president codified a ban on homosexuals from all federal employment as security risks. And according to David K. Johnson, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 federal employees lost their job by 1975, when the Civil Service Commission finally relaxed the ban. Meanwhile, state regulators in this period wrote rules to close queer establishments, and urban police created specialized units to arrest men cruising in public places. William Eskridge has estimated that between 1945 and 1970, there were as many as 1 million arrests for consensual same-sex intimacy nationwide. Now, let's get back to Norman Hayne. How do I know what happened to him? The police report says nothing about the phone call or his boss. There's no mention of the arrest in his job records. He and his former boss corresponded occasionally in the 1950s, but after that first reference to what a person and a friend you were, there's no hint or mention of this sequence of events. These were the peak years of what Margot Canaday has called the legal regime of heterosexuality. And these two men's secret remained just that. And it was in the interest of both men to keep it that way. The reason that I know their secret is because of what happened later to Hayne's boss, Walter Jenkins, the mensch, and his boss's boss, Lyndon Johnson. So on October 14th, 1964, less than 3 weeks before the presidential election, LBJ learned that Jenkins, his longest serving and most trusted aide, had been arrested 1 week earlier by plainclothes police officers while having sex with another man in a YMCA basement men's room 2 blocks from the White House. Not only that, Jenkins had been previously arrested in the same men's room in 1959. Jenkins was hospitalized for nervous exhaustion and quickly resigned. In an unusual statement the next day, Lady Bird Johnson called attention to Jenkins's wife and 6 fine children and his profound religious faith. By 1964, the government employee discredited by the revelation of his homosexuality had become a stock figure. In 1954, a senator killed himself in his office after allies of Joseph McCarthy threatened to expose his son's arrest for cruising a vice cop in Lafayette Park. And this episode was thinly disguised in a best-selling Pulitzer Prize-winning 1959 novel, Advise and Consent, which was later made into a movie. I've shown a couple stills here. I won't go into detail about it. In the fall of Walter Jenkins in 1964, many men witnessed their worst nightmare come to life in screaming headlines. What might happen to any one of them through exposure, often, though not always, at the hands of the police. What began as a routine arrest in a tea room, as gay men called cruisy public toilets, was reported on the front page of every newspaper. In a nationwide poll in its aftermath, 88% of respondents had heard of the Jenkins case. The book I'm writing now draws on the evidence that accumulated around this case, including press coverage, LBJ's recorded phone calls, and the FBI's investigation into whether national security was compromised, for which agents interviewed over 400 people and prepared a 94-page report plus 10 exhibits. Jenkins's eldest daughter, Beth, cajoled her siblings to talk to me also and made her father's personal papers available to me, which is a huge collection, 306 boxes. It turns out that Walter saved the entire avalanche of mail that he received in the fall of 1964, thousands of letters. These materials offer a unique vantage point for looking at the lived experiences of men like Jenkins, who may never have come out of the closet, understood themselves as gay, or challenged the legal system that ensnared them. And they offer a useful corrective to the selection bias in both litigation, oral histories, and the papers of homophile movement activists who did challenge anti-gay policies. So it's a reminder that the object of anti-gay policing was not gay people alone. Jenkins stayed married to his wife and never came out or identified as gay before his death in 1985. And in this, he was typical. In a study of participants in so-called tea room sex in St. Louis between 1965 and 68, most were married and living with their wives. By the way, although obviously Jenkins's place of work was not typical, the site of his arrest was. Public restrooms were the most common site of gay-related arrests in the 1960s on both felony and misdemeanor charges. In post-war gay immigration hearings and cases, Margot Canaday found a common trajectory from bathroom to border. And as Anna Levosky has noted, anti-gay policing consistently captured white middle-class suspects who otherwise rarely crossed paths with the police, which contributed to judges' ambivalence when the arrests reached trial courts. In letters to Jenkins, many mailed anonymously, men wrote about how Morrell's arrests had ruptured their lives. I walked in your shoes once myself, wrote a man from Alexandria, Virginia, being also married with a growing family and a responsible job in the federal service, only to have it blow up in my face following an arrest for disorderly conduct. From Tennessee, a Baptist minister wrote that until a year earlier, he had had a large church. Then there was a circumstance similar to yours in which I was relieved, and so on. Suggestions poured in as to how to rebuild his life. And in my remaining time, I'd like to summarize some of the conclusions I've drawn from the Jenkins archive about the sweeping yet often invisible impact of anti-gay policing in the 1950s and 1960s. First of all, as I mentioned, the hammer of anti-gay policing came down not solely on men who had a gay identity already or would understand themselves as gay in the future, nor even the many more who were caught in its dragnet or wriggled out of its clutches or feared they might be so ensnared. Rather, the state punished a much larger cast of characters, neighbors, wives, children, friends, and all those forced to recalibrate their personal ties to the outcast. In the case of Jenkins, these included the President of the United States, who was forced to conceal future contact with Jenkins, who had worked for him for 25 years, for the duration of his presidency. And their families were close friends and so on. Their tie was another male intimacy pressed into a closet. As David Sklansky has observed, stories like Walter Jenkins hit close to home for many Americans. And Sklansky suggests that the Supreme Court's justices' awareness of such cases may have shaped later Fourth Amendment rulings, notably Katz v. US, which involved wiretapping in a phone booth, which Justice Harlan called in his concurrence a temporarily private place whose momentary occupants' expectations of freedom from intrusion are recognized as reasonable. Second, a tea room arrest was typically followed by a drama of concealment. Irving Goffman observed that homosexuals are an illustration of the fact that sometimes your intimates are just the people from whom you're most concerned with concealing something shameful. If an arrestee was lucky, he might avoid a courtroom or jail cell. He almost certainly would not tell his wife, but if doing so was unavoidable, she too would likely try to keep the secret from others. A Connecticut woman wrote to Marjorie Jenkins, I never knew another woman with the same problem, never confided the trouble to anyone. There are probably many of us. So rather than being a behemoth, intimate governance often occurred out of sight. Third, the law's most powerful accomplices, including the press and the police, at times stretched the mesh of surveillance and widened its holes enough to let someone wriggle out. As Jenkins learned in 1959, perhaps overlearned, cruising a tea room was something a federal employee might get away with, even if he was arrested. So the FBI's report on Jenkins had a section called Alleged Association with Other Persons with Possible Homosexual Tendencies, describing a series of quiet resignations and close calls, including Norman Powell Hayne, and various other men acquainted with Jenkins over the years who had slipped through the state's dragnet and whose arrests were now sort of re-examined by the FBI in this inquiry. This included other employees of Congress. Fourth, compassionate exceptions could not be expected, but they were made often enough to be hoped for, especially for married men. In fact, the reason Jenkins's 1959 arrest did not come to light during background checks is because of a pattern of police non-enforcement in the name of compassion. So the Metropolitan Police Department's Morals Division placed sanitized versions of its reports in the department's identification file, which were then given to other agencies, including the FBI. And these sanitized reports downgraded the occupations of persons in high-level posts because of what disclosure might mean to the suspect's family and livelihood. So for Jenkins's 1959 arrest, the sanitized report altered his employer from Senate of the USA to unemployed. And the head of the Morals Division called this standard procedure in cases of this nature. So when LBJ became vice president, the Secret Service only got the sanitized report for loitering and did not evaluate the FBI criminal report as involving a serious matter. And so the hammer did not come down. Fifth, I'm going to skip my fifth and sixth points. When we view the anti-gay policing in the context of real lived experiences, what comes into focus is a straight state, both harsher and gentler than we've known. And I'll give the last word here to Norman Powell Hayne, who went into public relations and died young at age 55 in 1972. I don't know if he came out or was gay, but I do know that like many who wrote to Walter Jenkins in 1964, he offered an encouraging word. He wrote Jenkins, "Only one door in life never closes, but another doesn't open. Just give it time." But as Jenkins did give it time and their correspondence rekindled, Hayne tempered his cheerful tone, writing, "I probably shouldn't say this, but over these past few months, instead of a great society, I've often wondered whether or not we even have a civilized one." Thanks.
We'll give Giselle a couple moments to get the PowerPoint up. And I'll preface this by saying I've been working on this book proposal on Fort Grant and the assorted industrial schools in Arizona. And this was a case that I found associated with one of them. And I was just quickly going through the facts of the case and realized it was the aftermath of the case that was very much interesting to me. So I'll begin. It was the summer of 1933 when Ernest and Dorothea Turley packed up their two teenage children, David, age 12, Maddie, age 14. They left Coronado, California, a suburb of San Diego, so you can see it there, for St. John, Arizona. The Turleys would have found it to be a quiet but beautiful part of the American Southwest, but a striking difference from the Mediterranean-like weather of San Diego. By all expectations, the Turleys should have had a relatively peaceful family vacation. However, like many things in the desert, things change quickly and often without much warning. On the morning of November 15th, 1933, the family awoke to the smell of a skunk under the cabin. Dorothea refused to stay at the home any longer, leaving for town with her son David. Staying to deal with the pest was Ernest and Maddie. Armed with the double-barreled shotgun, the pair set to work, and by the end of the day, the skunk handled and the chores finished, the pair were walking back to the house when Maddie tripped and fell. Hitting the ground with the shotgun in her hands, the gun went off. Ernest cried out and fell to the ground. Hit in the back and the left hip, he yelled to Maddie, "Help, I've been shot." With law enforcement, medical assistance, and Dorothy and David finally arriving to the home, Ernest was sent to a local hospital for treatment and the family began to calm down. However, for reasons unknown and that are unrecorded, the events at the Turley cabin bothered the sheriff who had responded to the incident. And under later questioning, Maddie cracked, confessing an entirely new version of events. The accident was actually a sinister plot that began with her mother, Dorothea, and her beloved spirit board. Among the locals, Dorothea had gained a reputation for throwing parties where she would present her spirit board or Ouija board to guests where they would find gossip and just have fun. Dorothea had also gained another reputation as a brazen adulteress. Kent Pierce, a local man, was her, quote, picturesque cowboy that she dreamed of marrying one day, and she would tell neighbors this regularly. Nearly 16 years older than Kent, Dorothea was seemingly infatuated with the man. She would go on, quote, petting parties with him, sometimes even bringing her 14-year-old daughter along to accompany Kent's friend, Pollard Whitlock. During a spirit board session that only Maddie and Dorothea conducted, Dorothea decided to ask the board a frightful question. Who should die, my husband or my handsome cowboy? The board replied, your husband. Dorothea then asked, who should kill my husband? Good question. The board replied, MJ. It should note that Maddie's initials are MT, so either the spirit board is a bad speller. Dorothea then, in an odd sense of, I want to confirm this message, brings out a deck of cards. As Maddie would later testify, pulling the ace of spades meant death for Daddy. At this point, the case became national news. Ernest, who was a retired naval officer, was alive for several weeks after the shooting, but was then taken to the San Diego Naval Hospital on December 23rd and finally died of his injuries on December 26th. The case was finally a homicide. The murder and its subsequent legal dramas present a snapshot into gender, sexuality, youth, and the law in the rural Southwest. And believe it or not, it gets wilder than just the murder. And I ask you to think specifically of Maddie Turley, but also her mother almost as a foil. The series of events that triggers all this begins with Maddie's confession. With this act, Maddie's time in the juvenile court is essentially finished. She confesses, and by the end, she's quickly sentenced later that afternoon. But Maddie's going to continue finding herself in and out of court and in her mother's criminal case and subsequent civil litigation. And I'm only going to be able to cover a quick amount of her civil litigation because she files lawsuits like it's going out of style in the matter of months. We begin to understand the limitations of juvenile justice system in protecting girls and in its many forms in which juvenile rights. And in this case, a juvenile girl's rights over her body and autonomy, in particular sexual autonomy, continue to be debated, often without any regard to the child in question. Serving as the state's main witness, I should also add, this is Dorothea, and this is her in 1916 when she won the American Venus contest. So she's a beauty queen on top of everything else. Serving as the state's main witness, Maddie recounted the now well-known story about the Ouija board. But more importantly, Maddie gave an account of a violent and unstable family home. Dorothea was not just a former beauty queen obsessed with the supernatural and her handsome cowboy. She was physically abusive and even possibly sexually coercive. Maddie told the jury about one night in which Ernest confronted Dorothea over her most recent affair over the dinner table, and this was in Arizona. Enraged by the accusation, Dorothea flips the table, spilling food across the floor. The family was stunned as Dorothea screamed, "Get the hell out of this house before I kill you," as she reached for a nearby rifle. Both Ernest and David fled the house in terror, only to return in the middle of the night. In both Maddie's testimony and Dorothea's testimony, which implicated Maddie as the sole conspirator against Ernest, Maddie found herself without very few of the protections or the benefits of the juvenile court or the system it was meant to, the protections it was meant to give youth. Unlike juvenile court proceedings, which were kept private and no known transcript exists, Maddie's experience at her mother's trial put her in the public eye. While prosecutors aimed to use Maddie to vilify Dorothea, emphasizing Maddie's description of herself as weak under her mother's influence, she did not fare any easier in the defense's portrayal of events. Under cross-examination from Dorothea's attorneys, Maddie found herself increasingly portrayed as promiscuous, vengeful, and a murderous child. Dorothea offered two explanations of Maddie's actions. Either she was delusional under the influence of a spirit board, or the teenager was a rage-filled, sexed-up murderess who killed to spend time with her new grown-up Arizona cowboy boyfriend. And to complicate matters, Maddie was not only dealing with the competing theories over her role in the shooting. In the buildup to her mother's trial, which happened in June, the shooting November, dies in December, trial takes place in June. Another detail of the circumstances surrounding the crime was revealed: the role of sex, sexual coercion, and sexual assault. Dorothea, in a scheme to find time with Kent, would arrange car rides around the Arizona countryside. Joining the three was Kent's friend, the previously mentioned Pollard Whitlock, a man in his early 20s. Maddie continued, quote, "Mother and Kent in the front seat, Pollard and I in the back. The four would, quote, go places, park on the roadway, and pet." It's noteworthy that Maddie never describes Pollard as a friend or even a boyfriend. The circumstances under which Maddie had a relationship with Pollard are dubious. Maddie's testimony implies that her time with Pollard was more of a way to facilitate Dorothea's time with Kent, or potentially Kent's way to placate a friend who he kept bringing over to a married woman's house. Additionally, Maddie would allege that both men regularly stayed at the house, Maddie with Pollard in the ranch home, with Kent and Dorothea in the car outside. Maddie's involvement in her mother's sexual escapades and Dorothea's seemingly sexual coercion, or potentially even what I would consider sexual trafficking of her daughter, complicates the narrative of Maddie as offender. This narrative, fueled by sex and the supernatural, denied Maddie any of the rights the juvenile court was built to protect and provide youth. The complication continues when, prior to Maddie being sent to Randolph State Industrial School, and she would spend 6 years there, an arrest warrant was put out for Kent Pierce, not in connection to the murder. Rather, part of Maddie's confession included the allegation that Pierce had raped her. Announced by the same prosecutor who had arrested her mother, the arrest warrant alleged vague statutory acts against a minor. While Maddie's name is initially kept out of the papers, perhaps a result of some interest in protecting a minor's information, this anonymity is quickly broken. Reports of the rape again served to tie Maddie to the popular image of her as the, quote, Ouija board slayer. And this is used in descriptions of her as a victim. Even as a victim of sexual assault, Maddie continued to be denied protection or even a childhood. And these were some of the headlines during the Kent Pierce incident. Maddie's experience in the wake of the rape allegations only seems more dramatic when compared to Pierce's experience. Arrested and released within days when the charges are eventually dropped, Pierce becomes a media darling because of his relationship to the case. Following the allegations of rape being dropped, Kent announces his interest in pursuing a film career. Before taking off to Los Angeles at the train station, Kent spoke to the media about this exciting opportunity gained off the trauma of Maddie. Quote, "Say, I've got a lot of publicity out of this thing, and I think I would go good in the movies. If they're going to connect my name to anything like this, I'm going to collect for it. I'm a good cowboy. Guess I ought to be pretty good in the movies too." The handsome cowboy would soon experience what many young hopefuls arriving to LA's Central Station find in Hollywood: rejection. Later, during Dorothea's trial and under oath, prosecutors asked Kent about the purpose of this recent trip. Quote, "Was it to go into the movies?" the prosecutor asked. Kent would deny this, stating, "No, I just had a chance to go back to Los Angeles," claiming he was visiting family. On June 10th, 1934. How do I go back? Did not mean to do that. On June 10th, 1934, Dorothea Irene Turley would be found guilty by a jury of 12 men. Upon hearing the verdict, Dorothea reportedly refused to even look at Maddie, sitting in the courtroom. Upon her way out and on her way back to Randolph, David, who had been living in New York with Dorothea's family since his mother's arrest, confronted his sister. "Now you've done what you wanted to do with her. I hope you're satisfied." Shuffling out of the courtroom, Maddie was sent back to Randolph, where she would spend the next 6 years, but she was not done with her or her mother's legal drama. Dorothea would eventually have her case overturned by the Arizona State Supreme Court in 1936. She's granted a new trial. Prosecutors just don't file new charges against her. With her new freedom and several failed habeas corpus suits to get her daughter out of the state industrial school, Dorothea tries a novel legal strategy. After her only documented visit to the State Industrial School to see Maddie post her release, Dorothea is refused visitation of her daughter, not by the school officials, but rather by Maddie herself. And in that comment, you can see the note that Maddie had written and sent to her mother in lieu of visiting her. Enraged by this seeming betrayal by her own daughter, Dorothea files a suit against the matron of the industrial school, alleging alienation of affection, something which I've only ever seen against married or divorcing spouses or against a third party. So this is very new. I've not seen this in regards to an industrial school. This new lawsuit was more about the emotional conditions of confinement. Dorothea was in essence declaring her entitlement to a relationship with her daughter. When one considers Maddie's testimony, it's hard not to sympathize with her choice to distance herself from her mother. Once again, Maddie finds herself with little recourse and less legal rights as a young girl. The cases eventually dropped when Dorothea just refuses to go to Arizona to do more paperwork. She files these and then often just lets them die. This convoluted Ouija board slayer case gives historians an opportunity to examine what it meant to be a young girl with a history of childhood abuse and sexual trauma, sitting between the power of the state and the power of her parents. Maddie's case is a reminder that juvenile justice, juvenile injustice, and juvenile rights do not only exist within the confines of juvenile court. Rather, Maddie asks us to think critically about youth when we consider gender and the law and the additional challenges to maintain bodily autonomy as a young girl. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for pulling us together. Thanks to this esteemed panel. Good morning, and I'm going to be talking about identity inversions from discophobia to don't say gay. So we live in a time of extreme anxiety about identity. And we've witnessed historic legal and social movements for equality and freedom, but also furious backlash. And in thinking about this, there are, of course, various historical eras that one could mine to explore. Backlash, most obviously Reconstruction. I'm going to explore maybe an unexpected place, a time of my childhood that I don't remember because I was too young, but it was really fun to go back and understand what was happening in the broader culture in the 1970s, and how something as mundane as dance music sparked a moral panic about gay and Black culture corrupting heterosexuality. My talk will suggest that in important respects, the current moment mirrors the culture clash in the 1970s over the rise and fall of disco music. And I'm drawing on historical work by Alice Eccles, Gillian Frank, and Tavia Nyong'o. So disco music was born in Black and Latino urban clubs and gay clubs. And it's funny because I feel like as I was growing up, disco was sort of understood as like kitsch, you know, and so I don't think I even knew as a Black gay man where it came from because the way it was sort of recycled. But certainly there's a lot of evidence that sort of, you know, you had artists like the Village People and Sylvester, of course, Donna Summer, you know, Black folks, queer folks, women, gender nonconforming people were at the forefront of disco music. And then it ultimately goes mainstream and we see a huge backlash. Also, a lot of the music industry professionals who marketed the music were disproportionately gay, which was unusual in the music industry to have that many gay men with power. Disco also formed an important context for the gay liberation movement, The Stonewall Riot of 1969 disrupted the status quo and galvanized greater political and social activity among sexual and gender minorities. Gay men in the 60s often congregated in spaces owned by heterosexuals and controlled by the mafia. These spaces typically limited how men could interact. They would have to bring a woman as a beard often. They couldn't dance together. But these restraints collapsed as the 1970s brought more spaces that were unapologetically gay, with men dancing shirtless in a throng. And so we sort of saw the collapse of the standards of propriety that limited how you could interact in a gay club. And in fact, these clubs became so popular in cities like New York and San Francisco, and so trendy that curious heterosexuals invaded them. And these developments intersected with the Black civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, to destabilize racial, gender, and sexual boundaries. As Michael Bukai has written, many gay activists perceived gay, Black, and women's liberation as inextricably linked. They also saw the nuclear family as a vehicle of gender and sexual oppression. In the 1970s and the mid-1970s, disco became ubiquitous, breaking out of urban centers and gay clubs and into the mainstream. During this period, an early battle over gay rights began in Florida when a Dade County ordinance prohibited discrimination based on sexual or affectional preference. Anita Bryant became the face of the Save Our Children campaign. And of course, a theme that we still see today is the fixation on children and the idea that their sexual and gender identities are going to be corrupted by sexual and gender minority adults. The SOS campaign deployed this strategy of mobilizing children and protecting children to defeat several other anti-discrimination ordinances. Yet this anti-gay campaign provoked resistance in gay communities as well. Discos were frequently sites of organizing. A local group, the Miami Victory Campaign, even released a disco song entitled Hurricane Anita as a fundraising tool. Gay people and gay sexuality were more visible than ever, and this new visibility entwined with the ascent of disco. This context of heightened visibility and cultural upheaval set the stage for a ferocious disco backlash. Mainstream media sometimes depicted the crossover from gay clubs to pop radio and movies as a disco takeover. Mainstream white masculinity, which was associated with rock music, was depicted as embattled by disco. And in fact, rock music stations and clubs were struggling, and some were abandoning rock to ride the disco wave. There were news articles instructing straight white men how to navigate bisexual chic and partake of the disco scene. This often entailed drinking a lot or being high. And there was a lot of anxiety centered on straight men dancing in ways that had been gendered as suitable only for women and gay men. And we saw the critique of men like John Travolta, the Bee Gees, and Rod Stewart for popularizing disco, making it acceptable in Middle America, for being style conscious, primping, looking in the mirror, trying to attract the gaze of people of all different genders. Whereas men have been socialized to disdain and avoid homosexuality, disco drew straight identified men into spaces where they danced in proximity to gay men. According to one disco critic, disco clubbers were, quote, seemingly making it harder for straight men to measure up. As homosexual style, machine sculpted bodies, fastidious grooming, and fashion consciousness increasingly became masculine style, in what this author says now looks like the beginning of metrosexuality, some heterosexual men resisted. The rebel rocker seemed to be losing ground to the domesticated male who would not only dress up and muscle up, but would also shake his booty for his woman. And so we also saw some people reveling in the sort of collapse of social boundaries. So Truman Capote gushed of Studio 54. This is the nightclub of the future. It's very democratic. Boys with boys, girls with girls, girls with boys, blacks with whites, capitalists and Marxists, Chinese and everything else, all one big mix, right? So some people were celebrating this, but this freaked out a lot of people in Middle America, including Chicago, which was the center of the backlash. Also, and I wish I had more time for this, it should be noted that there were gender and racial barriers in a lot of the gay disco clubs. right? So there was a practice of favoring beautiful people, which skewed toward white gay men. There were women that were excluded unless they were with a beautiful gay man. And so there was all sorts of ways in which there was still a hierarchy of beauty and access in these clubs. It wasn't all kumbaya. The movie Saturday Night Fever catapulted disco to new heights. Stephen Holden, writing the Rolling Stone, wrote that Fever seduced middle America back onto the dance floor. By 1978, the soundtrack to Fever sold 30 million albums, at the time the highest selling soundtrack. Even the Muppets got in on disco. Sesame Street went disco. And in February 1979, 9 of the country's top 10 records were disco. One author said disco's hegemony was seen as further evidence of the growing power of racial and sexual minorities and the shrinking power of white straight men. So here's the backlash. Chicago DJ Steve Dahl was an architect of this backlash. He had lost his job with a radio station that switched to a disco format. So one thread here is sort of the resentment of working class white men who see they're losing out in this new environment. And he ends up working at a rock station, but he had to take a pay cut. He really linked disco to gayness by including lisping the word disco whenever he would mention it. He mobilized what he called an anti-disco army dedicated to the eradication of the dreaded musical disease known as disco. And he claimed that 10,000 card-carrying members of this army, they would show up at various places, often thousands of people in Chicago and elsewhere in the Midwest, and sort of stage protests of disco. And the main event of this series was Disco Demolition Night, July 12th, 1979, at Comiskey Park in Chicago, a doubleheader between the Chicago White Sox and the Detroit Tigers. And this is roughly 10 years after Stonewall. So an enormous crate was set on the field. It was said to be full of 50,000 disco records. The crowd chanted "Disco sucks" and "Death to Disco," and there are still t-shirts that you can buy on Amazon that say "Disco sucks." Dahl, dressed in military fatigues and accompanied by a blonde model, detonated fireworks inside the crate, which sent shards of the exploded records flying. 7,000 fans rushed the field and went wild. The police had to intervene to restore the order, and the game had to be canceled. So today, disco is enjoying a revival. Yeah, those are the t-shirts. You can buy them, on Amazon. Disco is back with Beyonce, Dua Lipa, Jessie Ware, and others scoring commercial and critical hits. We don't see the same controversy around disco, which again, I think has been rendered as kitsch. But I think one could argue that drag is the new disco. So there's immense anxiety about shifting social boundaries, and just some of the context here, which we've all lived through, but to remind you, in 2015, the Supreme Court announces a fundamental right to marry. In Obergefell, Windsor's an earlier case there. In fall 2017, the Me Too movement erupts as the New York Times and the New Yorker, other news outlets devote considerable resources to documenting problems of sexual abuse and harassment. We see Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, and Kevin Spacey, many others losing their jobs, predominantly white men. And then in 2020, the world was rocked again by a string of high-profile police and vigilante killings of unarmed Black people, including George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And global protests break out, and lots of white folks, like mainstream Midwest white folks, are marching and holding up Black Lives Matter signs. And again, this creates anxiety about like what is happening to the world, what is happening to the order of white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia. But then things shift, and part of a project that I'm working on is trying to document how this happened, that now the same outlets that were talking about sexual harassment at the height of Me Too, like the New York Times, are obsessed with asking multiple versions of the question, has the left gone too far, right? So the focus shifts from racism to wokism, right? The anxiety is about cancel culture and how we redeem men who've been canceled. And this really suggests explicitly or implicitly that the new victims of discrimination, it's white people, it's men. Think of comments about like, we should be worried about our sons and what's going to happen to them if they're falsely accused of something. Heterosexuality, cisgender identities are seen as threatened by radical leftists who are trying to remake society. And now we're seeing this embodied in law, right? So Trump's 2020 executive order banning various DEI policies, which was the template that was carried forward in many states. The anti-critical race theory laws passed in various states, Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay law and its recent extensions, and of course, Tennessee's labeling of drag performances as obscene. And we're seeing artists like Madonna and Paramore's Hayley Williams rallying to support drag. We also saw HRC reveal in an ad that the Tennessee governor who signed the law had in fact appeared in drag as a teenager. And of course, he's like, well, that's totally different than what we're banning. But again, the law actually treats drag as inherently sexual and threatening. But he claimed that his performance of drag in high school was completely disconnected from that. A couple of other pop culture examples. Bill Maher in an episode last year cited a Gallup poll showing that sexuality is changing at a previously unprecedented rate. He argued that the public identifies, that the share of the public that identifies as LGBTQ is doubling each generation. And therefore, quote, if we follow this trajectory, we will all be gay in 2054. And I say, bring it on, right? I'm just kidding, that could go viral and I might get doxxed. So I should be careful about what I say at Stanford. That was a joke, yeah. More recently, conservatives have boycotted Anheuser-Busch because they've employed a young trans woman influencer, Dylan Mulvaney, to promote Bud Light. And I wish I had more time to talk about this because I am completely astonished at how people are losing their minds over this woman just holding up a beer can. Right, and how this has turned into Kid Rock. Remember Kid Rock? Shooting up Bud Light, and many people posting videos of violent displays toward Bud Light, which feels like a proxy for violence toward trans women. So I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A.
Go until.
Yeah, let's out of 12 or 5.
Okay, perfect. Great. So I was just so interested to read these fascinating papers when I received them, and they were kind of really page turners, as you can see from the presentations here. And I wanted to draw out kind of 3 general themes that I think cross the pieces, and then a couple of specific points that may be relevant to one or more papers. So one thing that I found really just fascinating about the juxtaposition of these pieces was this emphasis on what I think of as kind of spillover and the porousness of institutions and also the multiplicity of uses. And I think this comes out maybe most clearly from Doris's paper, where she's really addressing how these institutions of juvenile justice and juvenile reform wind up being also vehicles for entry into other parts of the criminal system, for maybe drawing in other protagonists. We have the claim that arises about her rape, then in just the ways in which the institution of juvenile justice isn't self-contained, but rather speaks to all of these other sectors of society. But I think you see the same thing about the federal government in Timothy's paper, where it turns out that the federal government, maybe has a bunch of people who are allied in other identitarian ways that aren't really coming out in official documentation. And then also, I think in the context of disco and other things that Russell was talking about, that there's a kind of spillover from cultural institutions elsewhere into the legal. So this idea of spillover, and that brings me to a second point, which is really about the ways in which social significations become legal significations, and legal significations, on the other hand, become social signification. So I was struck with this description of how a person who is suddenly arrested for their conduct in a bathroom then becomes kind of socially stigmatized, or becomes that their job is imperiled, all of these other entailments, right? That there's this sort of move from the legal to the social on the one hand, but then also that with disco or with drag, that somehow the drag performance becomes a legally relevant performance at some point. And so how does that transformation occur back and forth between the social and the legal? And then a third point is really about the sensitivity that all three scholars have displayed towards thinking historically about identity formations. And I think that that really comes across in all of the papers. One thing, kind of starting with Russell, I think it's very interesting that disco becomes identified as gay almost through the backlash, right? Or that drag becomes, exclusively gay through backlash. And then, there has to be a distinction of like, oh, this wasn't a real drag performance. This was just something else I did, right? So that this relation between, kind of a claim of identity that's established through a particular kind of backlash, as opposed maybe to the more fluid self-identifications of the disco community at the time. And then also thinking about Doris's paper, kind of who is identified as a juvenile and for what purposes, because there's the kind of criminal and educational identification, but then, and this maybe relates back to the paper on the age of consent, there's the question of like exactly, who is a juvenile or mature enough to consent in a sexual context, and all of these other issues. So in what context is someone actually a juvenile or not? And then I related also to Timothy's paper. I thought it was very interesting, the kind of flagging of the fact that a lot of the subjects are not gay of the piece, right? That they're, they have a complicated identity in relation to families and children and the criminal justice system. So I think that those treatments of identity categories were really interesting to me. And then just a couple of sort of specific comments, I would say. I was interested in how social networks operate in some of these contexts, right? So that the fact that you can kind of call upon a friend or, friends in high places to both give a financial surety, but then also maybe, kind of demonstrate that you're part of a reputable community in the context of these prosecutions that Timothy was talking about was interesting. And then just throughout this, the role of different forms of kind of social endeavors and how they become stereotyped, right? So whether it's disco, performing seances, or using a Ouija board, or other things that there are these kind of identitarian stereotypes that emerge around particular kinds of cultural forms. And then I also, just as in terms of being historians, that thinking about what sources are available, right? So, how much can you get from a police record versus other sources? How much can you actually look for sources, or do you just coincidentally find them? And then, with Doris, that there's an archive through the institution, but then also how else do you uncover sources? So with that, I'll leave it and open to questions.